that have been popular and keep doing them.
When did you find out about her?
About a week, 2 weeks ago.
Really?
Yeah, I made an announcement at church 2 Sundays ago. So it has been a whirlwind of emotions for all of us. Okay, let me go ahead and start the live videos. Okay. Shine within our hearts, loving Master, the pure light of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand the message of your gospel. Instill in us also the reverence of your blessed commandments, so that putting down all sinful desires, we pursue a spiritual life, thinking and doing all those things that are well pleasing to you. We are blessed together, beginning as Father, and your all holy, good life, creating spirit, now and forever, into the ages of ages. Amen. All right, so can anyone tell me what we've been discussing in our last class?
Paul talked about the giving of the Corinthians and how it was important that they continue to give. And he was thankful that they were giving liberally. He was expecting them to continue to do so.
He was giving us the model of stewardship that is used to this day, the idea of giving to the central church and the church then divvying up to help the other churches. He used the example of a city that is not as affluent as Corinth, giving very generously, and was trying to uplift them to give generally as well. We began reading chapter 10. We were looking into spiritual warfare, and we were looking at the idea of how this is done. Does anyone have any remembrance of this?
Yeah.
So we'll just go ahead and begin with the start of chapter 10 then. Now I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent am bold toward you. But I beg you that when I am present I may not be bold with that confidence by which I intend to be bold against some, who think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. The strongholds, of course, he's talking about are the strongholds of our carnal desires and spiritual impediments. Casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. The Orthodox Study Bible, looking at this, says that St. Paul is replying to charges of his opponents. Far from being weak, he is extraordinarily strong. But strength in spiritual warfare sometimes appears as weakness to the world. The meekness and gentleness of Christ is sometimes communicated in a lowly or humble fashion, and sometimes boldly. The Orthodox Study Bible continues by saying, the battlefield of spiritual warfare includes entrenched spiritual fortresses, strongholds, human reason, arguments, human and angelic powers, every high thing that exalts itself, ideas, thoughts, and the will. Our weapons include the cross, prayer, and the word of God. Both our thoughts and our actions are to be submissive to Christ. The church is God's fortress, marching against the strongholds of disobedience. So in other words, we have to shift our vision. We have to shift the idea of worldly power, worldly virtues, and see how St. Paul is talking here about the spiritual virtues and the spiritual warfare of what they are actually contending against. Verse 7.
Father,
Yes.
what does it mean in the Orthodox Study Bible where it says our thoughts are to be submissive to Christ?
So there are many church fathers that talk about our thoughts. And have you ever noticed that when you're praying, all these different thoughts come at you?
Oh, yeah.
That you get distracted, like, oh, did I turn off the dishwasher? Is the oven on? What am I going to do for tomorrow's lunch? All these thoughts, you're like, what does this have to do with my prayer time? It's the idea that our mind is constantly awash in thoughts. And so we have to make them obedient to God and to us. And so the idea of our thoughts warring against us is more along the lines of basically, instead of being mindful, like a soldier ready to see where an arrow is coming, because a lot of times these thoughts really aren't our own. It's the devil and his minions basically saying, hey, think about this, think about this, think about this. And instead of taking a moment to go, wait a second, I'm not going to give that any place to sit with me, we say, oh yeah, let me think about that for a minute. And then we realize I've completely realized that I have not listened to a single thing into prayer. I have not taken in a single thing into my thoughts. And so to be at war with our thoughts means that we are trying to have self-control. Does that make sense?
Sure it does, yeah. So we have to be watchful.
Exactly. And again, this is not something that is just the idea of just physical watchfulness, but spiritual watchfulness.
Thank you.
Do you look at things according to the outward appearance? If anyone is convinced in himself that he is Christ, let him again consider this in himself, that just as he is Christ, even so we are Christ. For even if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which the Lord gave us for edification and not for your destruction, I shall not be ashamed, lest I seem to terrify you by letters. For his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful, but his speech, bodily presence, is weak, and his speech contemptible. Let such a person consider that when we are in word by letters, when we are absent, such we will also be indeed when we are present. So in other words, they're trying to say that, St. Paul he's trying to act all tough in his letters, but when he gets here, he's going to be a weak-kneed person that won't be able to speak. St. Paul is taking that thought away from them, saying, no, if I have to, I will speak this way to you in person too. I'm just choosing to be lowly. The Orthodox Study Bible says that some teachers in Corinth had claimed a special knowledge or of an esoteric relationship to Christ. Paul here counters their claim by boasting somewhat more of his authority, not because he wants to boast, but because the boastfulness of his enemies must be shown to be not only empty, but ruinous for those who believe them. For we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. We, however, will not boast beyond measure, but within the limits of the sphere which God appointed us, a sphere which especially includes you. For we are not overextending ourselves as though our authority did not extend to you. For it was to you that we came with the gospel of Christ, not boasting of things beyond measure, that is, in another man's labors, but having hope that as your faith is increased, we shall be greatly enlarged by you in our sphere, to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's sphere of accomplishment. But he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. For not he who commends himself is approved, but whom the Lord commends. So again, the idea is that these people have been entrusted to St. Paul. St. Paul is not going into other people's vineyards and trying to maneuver the flock. He's only trying to help the people that have been entrusted to him, the authority that has been given to him with these people. So there are these spheres of influences. This is one of the reasons why you see different bishops. You see a bishop in this area, bishop in this area, bishop in this area. And the commendation doesn't come from people, but from God. Chapter 11. Oh, that you would bear with me in a little folly, and indeed you do bear with me. For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy. For I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. But I fear, lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. For if he who comes preaches another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or if you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you may well put up with it. For I consider that I am not at all inferior to the most eminent apostles, even though I am untrained in speech. Yet I am not only in knowledge, but we have been thoroughly manifested among you in all things. So let's explore a little bit what the Orthodox study has to say about this. Paul compares the reality of the new covenant to the Garden of Eden, where Christ is Adam and the church is Eve, and where Satan is up to his same craftiness. Paul's desire is to present a pure church, a chaste virgin, to Christ at the second coming. The first element of a chaste virgin is the purity of the Orthodox doctrine. Not human persuasiveness, but apostolic content is important. Paul is a part of the apostolic college, which continues in line with the original 12 disciples. So in other words, St. Paul loves to use this imagery, the idea of the chaste virgin, that we are being presented to God, to be pure and undefiled in the second coming. And it is done with simple language. And the problem is that we have these deceivers that are trying to come in with flowery language to try to abrogate the message of Christ, to change it into something that is not. He continues on verse 7. Did I commit sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. And when I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. And in everything I kept myself from being burdensome to you. And so I will keep myself. As the truth of Christ is in me, no one shall stop me from this boasting in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I do not love you? God knows. But what I do, I will also continue to do, that I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the things of which they boast. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose ends will be according to their works. This again is the idea that people coming in with flowery language, trying to preach a gospel that is separate to that which Paul has preached. Remember, St. Paul is talking about the idea of suffering, manfully holding on to ourselves when we endure such things. Whereas these people are coming in saying, oh, you don't need to suffer. God doesn't want you to have any struggles. It's all supposed to be easy. And so St. Paul is telling them that if we follow that advice, it's going to be ruinous. The Orthodox Study Bible says that St. Paul's doctrine is taught out of pure motives. A mark of apostolic authenticity is the refusal of excessive money. The clergy draw their living from the church, but not to the point of getting rich. Paul's opponents dared not make this claim. And we've seen this in some Christian circles where the clergy seem to be the wealthiest of the wealthy amongst their flock, whereas in the Orthodox Church, at least, the priesthood should always be somewhat in the middle. They should never be rich. That's not the point of the priesthood. You're supposed to serve people, not be served. I say again, let no one think me a fool. If otherwise, at least receive me as a fool, that I also may boast a little. What I speak not according to the Lord, but as it were foolishly in this confidence of boasting. Do you notice how he's being very careful to differentiate his personal feelings versus his dogmatic reality? This is something that's very, very important for us to do, to understand when we are preaching and talking about something that is specific to us versus something that is specific versus something that is specific to the dogmatic reality of the church. The Orthodox Study Bible looks at this and says that the Corinthians thought they were wise enough to elevate church leaders.
Hello? Can you hear me? I can't hear you.
Steve, can you not hear us?
Just go ahead. I can't hear you.
Huh. Okay. So the Orthodox Study Bible says the Corinthians thought they were wise enough to evaluate church leaders. They had become enamored with false apostles who championed themselves using the methods and values of the world, full of outward show and crafty talk. They disparaged Paul, seeing him as a weakling without credentials. As a result, they were in bondage, defrauded, even brutalized. Paul, playing the devil's advocate, takes up the methods of these false prophets to show them as fools. He satisfies them in the hope of the Corinthians will thereby see through their charade. What I speak not according to the Lord, but as it were foolishly in this confidence of boasting. Seeing that many boast according to the flesh, I also will boast. For you put up with the fools gladly, since you yourselves are wise. For you put up with it as if one brings you into bondage, if one devours you, if one takes from you, if one exalts himself, if one strikes you on the face, to our shame. I say that we were too weak for that. But in whatever anyone else is bold, I speak foolishly. I am bold also. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measures, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren. In other words, St. Paul is telling them that if I'm going to boast, I will boast that I have served the Lord. And in many of these cases where he's talking about these things, it is worth noting that most people would die if experiencing even one of those. In weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble, and I do not burn with indignation? If I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my infirmity. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. In Damascus, the governor, under Aretas the king, was guarding the city of Damascenes with a garrison, desiring to arrest me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hands. So in other words, St. Paul is showing the Corinthians his plaudits. His plaudits are not in his academic pedigree, but in the amount of things he has suffered for them and for Christ. This is one of the great measures of St. Paul, that he shows us that the strength of God is measured and shown within our weakness, not our own personal strength. Because despite our weaknesses, God manifests himself and strengthens all people. Any questions on chapter 11 before we move on to chapter 12? Peter and Kelly, you are muted.
It makes me think I don't do enough for Christ after reading all the things he sacrificed and does. So I'm thinking, okay, what can I do? And it always goes back to my prayer life and my prayer rule, and not just sticking to it, but praying more often.
It's incredible because when we look to
What's
St.
that?
Paul, I said it's incredible because when we look to St. Paul and some of the words that he uses, it almost sounds boastful. And then he presents this as like, okay, yeah, I get it now. Now I understand why he can boast, because he actually is living the life of an apostle.
Exactly. I mean, look how all the tortures he's had. And I mean, you're right, Father. One of these things I would die.
For example, when we see from the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. The reason why they said 40 stripes minus 1 was because for some reason they had this idea that if you hit somebody with the rod 40 times, that would kill them. And so it had to be 39. Never mind the fact that many people died long before they got to the late 30s in those beatings. To be stoned, obviously most people did not survive a stoning. Being drowned in the deep. I mean, all these things that he endured is incredible. To say the least, it shows that, if you're going to be a true servant of God, you are going to suffer a little bit. But he will preserve you and show his glory and his strength in you. All right.
It's amazing how daily we're supposed to pick up our cross and follow Christ, and yet we still complain. I mean, I'm reading this and I'm like, really? How can you complain? Look what, you know what I'm saying? It's hard to be a Christian, that's for sure. I guess the way we were brought up and more privileged with stuff, and maybe that's why we have all our problems that we do have, Father, or what we're seeing in our world today.
It could be. We have to also remember that each one of our crosses is specifically made for us, in the sense that, a cross that you look at someone else and like, well, there's no way I could carry that. Well, there's a reason you're not carrying it, because you probably couldn't carry it. Just as the cross you are carrying is probably a cross that someone else could not bear. It's specifically made for our salvation. These things it's not a matter of competition of, okay, who can suffer the most for Christ. It's the idea of what has God given you and how are you carrying it. Yeah. Chapter 12. It is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. In other words, all these things that he just did, talking about the things that he's endured, he's like, that's not profitable. It's not helpful. I only did this to basically hush this Corinthian mode of giving plaudits as to why you should listen to me. St. Paul said basically, you shouldn't need these things to listen to me. The value of what I'm saying alone should be enough to listen to me. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ 14 years ago, whether in the body, I do not know. Whether out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Such a one was caught up to heaven. And I know such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. How he was caught up into paradise and heard the inexpressible words, which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast, except in my infirmities. Of course, we all know, what man is he talking about? Himself. That was him. But he's saying that I'm not going to boast in the fact that I got to see the glories of heaven, the real thing of what we're all fighting for. He said, I will boast in my infirmities. I will boast in my weaknesses. For though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool. For I will speak the truth, but I refrain lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, A thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. The Orthodox Study Bible says that St. Paul's opponents probably boasted of visions and revelations, for Paul mentions one of his, 14 years ago, would date the event before his missionary journeys. Paul employs two terms used by Jews to describe heavenly realms. The third heaven is the highest heaven. Paradise, where God is surrounded by the assembly of the just, is the city of God. Unlike his opponents, who publicly proclaim their own greatness in their mystical experiences, Paul sees his thorn in the flesh as given to him precisely so that he might not be exalted. What was this thorn? Perhaps a chronic physical problem, or deluded Christian leaders, or hard-headed Israelites. Nevertheless, for Paul, his weakness, not his mystical experiences, is the means by the power of Christ remaining in him. Also, another note that people have said when talking about this thorn is that the fact that St. Paul is not defining it specifically is beneficial to us, because what it says is that any of us can have a thorn in the side. Any of us can have any number of things that prevents us from being super exalted or joyous, so that we don't lose track of things. So in other words, this thorn in the side is keeping St. Paul grounded. Otherwise, he would just be flying all the time, just in absolute joy and not able to focus on what he's actually doing. It's amazing to me, because when someone has seen the glories of God, all of these other things that St. Paul has talked about become trivial, mean nothing. All he can think about is the glory of God. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distress,